Topic Notes 10.1 The Intertidal Zone. This is a picture I took in the Pacific Northwest off of Vancouver Island in Canada. It specifically shows the intertidal zone along a rocky shore. Now, one of the first places marine scientists actually started to study the ocean environment were intertidal areas just like this, simply because it's very easy to access it to study. And now that you guys have learned a lot about ocean dynamics and tides and how water works, basically, we can now focus on this particular habitat and community and see really what's going on and apply some of that ecology knowledge we learned about earlier in the year. We can also take a look at intertidal communities here in South Florida. The main idea today is that the intertidal zone is defined by changing conditions, and the organisms that live there have a range of adaptations that are used to survive in this environment. This, of course, comes with our usual set of learning goals. So again, make sure you peruse them and make sure you're familiar with them. So we'll begin with some basics. The littoral or intertidal zone is that benthic or bottom zone between highest and the lowest spring tide shorelines. Now, this can be a very stressful environment for marine life simply because there's a lot of physical factors that are going on. Wind, waves, exposure to sunlight, and that puts a lot of selective pressure on specific organisms. And like I mentioned before, scientists have been studying this particular type of habitat for quite a while, and the methods are pretty sound. Here in this picture, you'll see some students just like yourselves out there doing some classical intertidal studies. Now, there are a variety of littoral or intertidal zones, and we'll talk a little bit about them. The name littoral actually comes from the Littoral snail that sort of is a trademark of some of these habitats. And we've already studied some of the intertidal zones. If you think about things like estuaries, we pretty are familiar with that. River deltas, which the top picture there is the river delta from the Cook Inlet in Alaska, is very common to see very intertidal zones within that area. We also have sandy and muddy shorelines, which can provide intertidal zones. And what we are going to focus on a little bit more today are the rocky intertidals that we see along the Pacific Northwest and also in the Northeast here in North America. Now, like I mentioned before, the conditions within the intertidal zone can be relatively stressful. They are regularly exposed to air, which is also known as immersion with an E, and that provides a lot of danger in terms of desiccation, which means drying out. So if you think about it, marine life that are used to being underwater, if they're exposed to air and they lose too much moisture from their bodies, that can be a bad thing. So there's various types of adaptations that different marine life have developed to combat this particular problem. One is called clamming up, in which they close and seal their shells very tightly to seal in the moisture. A lot of times these can be things like the limpet there on the bottom left, where it seals itself onto the rock. That's actually a snail, but it seals itself on during those low tide moments. Other species, like crabs, obviously, on the right there, they can move down with the water to stay underwater or near the surface at least. And so that mobility gives them some flexibility in the intertidal zone. And of course, other species have just learned to deal with drying out. The middle picture is of seaweed and algae called fucus, and it can stay dry for a certain amount of hours before it needs to be replenished with water. So those are just a bit of some of those adaptations to deal with that immersion into air and that desiccation issue. Now, there's a few other things that come with that exposure to air, really, and that's drastic changes in temperature from high to low. If you think about it, as the tide goes down, the sun can bake down and create really high temperatures. Reversely so, during cooler times of the year, it can actually make it really, really cold exposed to the air. Remember, water tends to stay a little bit more stable in terms of its temperature. And some of the different species tolerate this. First of all, some of them can just tolerate those extremes in temperature. Others have developed ways to get rid of heat. For example, shells that have ridges or lighter colors to be able to either reflect and or give off heat, and hopefully keep that balance a little lower within their bodies. Then, of course, we have drastic changes in salinity. If you have a lot of precipitation or runoff, you might have a lot of fresh water being added into the system right next to that intertidal zone. Similarly, if there's not a lot of precipitation, the evaporation can actually cause the salinity to get very high in intertidal areas. And again, some species can osmotically deal with that change in salinity. Some just by clamming up, just like keeping in and retaining the water, it also keeps out some of those drastic changes in salinity. Now, when we talk about mechanical stress, we're talking about wave action that's going to occur especially on high energy coastlines where you have a lot of swells and wave action coming in. So the species that live there have to be able to cope with that, and they do that in a few ways. First of all, some of them can find more sheltered locations, either in crevices or cracks within the rocks. They can move down out of the wave action if they need to, things like that with crabs. Some mollusks, like limpets on the top left, have that big muscular foot that they're able to really attach onto that rock and have a very low profile shell. That allows the waves to kind of go back and forth without having much of a way to lift them off the rock itself. Other things like mussels have these basal threads that they use to attach to the rocks, so they're really secure. Some of the algae that's diagrammed there on the bottom left are very flexible and they have these strong holdfasts, but the algae itself can wave back and forth in the waves, and it's very tough, so it doesn't break very easily. And then, of course, you have barnacles, which are again attached to the rocks with relatively low profile shells, and that again allows them to really maintain their position in that surf zone. Beyond the physical stresses that we're talking about, there's also biological stresses, and that generally comes into the form of competition for available space. And space is a big deal in the intertidal zone, especially on rocky intertidal zones, which we're going to spend the most time talking about. And there's kind of a few things that go on here. First of all, if you're an intertidal organism and you're going to live there, you need to have an effective means of dispersing through that system. That generally has to do with reproductive means, dispersing larvae, and having larval recruitment to that area. Another issue is growing regardless of what's there and being able to displace or grow over competitors. And so there's a lot of competition that goes on within that intertidal zone for space on the rocks, and specifically spaces in areas that are more adapted to that specific organism that you might be talking about. So like I said, we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about the rocky intertidal zone as more of a classic example study. And these areas are going to occur where you have a lot of exposed rock. This tends to be active continental margins like the Pacific Northwest, or areas with high current that removes a lot of sediment, so you have bare rock exposed. Examples of this are right here. The picture on the left is of the California coastline. The northern California coastline is just very predominated by rocky shores, and the picture to the right is a little bit farther up in Canada. But both are great examples of those rocky intershore intertidal zones. Plus, these are active plate margins where you have subduction zones, whatnot going on. So this is why you have a lot of that rock available. So just a couple of terms to know. The term epifauna, if we haven't run across it before, is simply a term that says animals that live on a surface or of any type of substance. It can be rock, sand, mud, whatever. Obviously, we're going to be talking a lot about rock here. So when you see the term epifauna, that's what we're talking about. And as I mentioned earlier, there's this thing called vertical zonation. And vertical zonation is simply that separation of organisms into prominent horizontal bands defined by specific organisms that are distributed based on those physical and biological factors. And it just happens to be a vertical zonation from lower intertidal all the way up into the upper intertidal zone, which we're going to get into in a minute. However, just the generalities here, the upper regions are going to be exposed to air. They're going to be exposed to changing air temperatures, solar radiation, desiccation, things like that. That's going to make it a lot tougher for some species to be able to live there. The lower regions are going to be exposed for a much shorter period of time before the tide returns, and thus you're going to end up having a lot more diversity in these areas, but a lot more competition. And thus, that's really the study of ecology in and of itself, right? The distribution and range of various different organisms and why that is. So when we study the intertidal zone, it's like a little microcosm of ecology study. And those upper limits are generally going to be determined by those physical factors, where the lower limits are going to be more determined by the biological factors. So as we get into the intertidal zonation and the zonation scheme, I have to mention the Stephensons. The Stephensons were a husband and wife team that put out a universal zonation scheme in 1949. And this was really the basis of a lot of the intertidal work that was done up until that point and beyond. If you look at this graph, you'll see height on the shore on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, it would be the degree of wave action from exposed to very sheltered, meaning not so many waves. And from there, you'll see the upper limits of specific types of species. For example, the barnacles, the littoral snails. And you'll also see some various terminology, like the supralittoral fringe, the mid-littoral zone, things like that. That's what we're talking about. They looked at these zonations based on the species that lived there and the various different mechanical wave stress, the height, the desiccation, things like that, and created this scheme. So we're going to briefly look at this scheme. We're going to start with the supralittoral fringe, which is the splash zone. It's the uppermost area covered by the highest of spring tides. It's usually that's why they call it the splash zone. You have a lot of spray and crashing waves that will throw some moisture up there. It tends to be an area that has a lot of extreme temperature variation. It's relatively low diversity. There's only a few types of mollusks and algae and lichens that can live there. Now we have the mid-littoral zone, and this is where you have a lot more diversity. It's the true middle, if you will, of the intertidal zone. It's regularly exposed during low tides to the air, but it's also generally covered up with water during high tides. It tends to have a lot of heavy wave stress simply because that's where the waves are coming and going as the tide's going up and down. And due to all of these changing factors, you can have some zonation within the mid-littoral zone itself, because obviously the lower mid-littoral is going to have a little bit more access to water for a longer period of time than the upper mid-littoral. And you can see things like mussels, some of the larger algae and fucus start to appear there as well. So it's a much more diverse area. Now, as we go down, we get into the infralittoral fringe, and this is the area below the mid-littoral zone that extends from the lowest of the low tides to the upper limits reached by a lot of the large kelps or laminarias. Now, kelp, if you remember, is a type of macroalgae. They have holdfasts, and then their stalks go up into the water column. And kelps are the largest. They literally look like trees underwater, even though they're algae. But they are limited, obviously, because they need to be in the water. Now, this infralittoral fringe is going to be relatively diverse compared to all of the other zones above it, simply because it has a lot more access to the water more of the time. A lot more species can handle it there. However, you start to get into much higher competition between different populations. And the last zone I'll talk about is the infralittoral, or the subtidal, the zone or the region of the shore covered by water even during low tides. So this is the area that never really gets exposed to air at all. It goes a lot deeper. You have a lot of your fish species that live there, things like that. Now, I've gotten the chance a couple of times to explore the rocky intertidal zone in the Pacific Northwest. This is actually some pictures I took from Ketchikan, Alaska, and it's a really cold water compared to here in Florida. Obviously, I have like a 7 mil wetsuit on, but there you get to see that kelp. This is bull kelp on the far right, extending up to the surface of the water. And all along through the infralittoral fringe and the sublittoral, there are quite a lot of species to be seen. Everything from various different types of sea stars and sea cucumbers, sea anemones, chitons, limpets, little nudibranchs that go onto some of the different algae, crabs, some of the little rockfish and whatnot. It's a very diverse area, and some of the more mobile species will actually make their way up into the mid-littoral zone during high tides and then come back down during low tides. And others will find a way to stay in the mid-littoral zone through finding tide pools. And these are depressions in the rocks which retain the water during low tide. It prevents some of those species from being exposed to air, but it creates other challenges. These tide pools can actually have very high temperatures, especially during the day. There can be a decrease in the amount of dissolved oxygen, because remember, the warmer the water, the less dissolved oxygen can actually be held in that water. And that fluctuates. At night, they can be very, very cold. Salinity can also change, especially depending on rain or evaporation rates, especially night, day as well. So there can be very abrupt changes. When the tide comes back in, all that new ocean water comes in and mixes in. So animals that live in the tide pools have to be able to adapt to those circumstances. And this is where I'll bring back the concept of succession. So if you don't remember exactly what succession is, go back and look at your earlier note sets from earlier on in the year in ecology. However, it occurs after any sort of disturbance, and this can occur during intertidal zones, even if a bad storm comes and kind of displaces animals, creating open space. That can create a successional process to fill that space up. New rock can be actually formed through volcanic processes or geologic processes as well. So succession is a big factor in intertidal zones, just like most other communities. And of course, I want to spend a minute talking about tropical rocky shores, such that we have here in South Florida. You're going to deal with some data from these types of locations, um, either from doing direct field work or looking at data from the field in our local area. What we generally have is this Anastasia limestone formation that does come out along the beach. It's a sedimentary rock. You can find little bits of shell and coral pieces in there as well. And it gets exposed as sand is moved away from the rock. Sand levels go down. It can be covered with sand as sand levels rise. So it's a very shifting habitat. And it's not as stable as some of the rocky intertidal zones you have in the Pacific Northwest, as an example. Most of the rocky intertidals we have near us are found in Blowing Rocks Preserve and Coral Cove Park, both up in the Jupiter Hobe Sound area. Now, the rest of this mostly we're going to deal with in class, but I just wanted to do some identification of a few species just so you know what we're looking at. On the far left here are the Littoral snails. You often find them, they're relatively small. They can be huddled together like this. They tend to be a little bit higher in the intertidal zone. Then you have the Neuratina snails, which are a little bit more round and a little larger. Irregular worm snails look like some sort of tube worm, but they're actually a type of mollusk, and you can see their squiggly little hard-tubed bodies along the rocks there with some of the Littoral snails gathered around. Next up is the chitons. The chiton is in the far left there. And chitons, also known as hairy chitons, are these 8 segmented shells. They do have a dorsally compressed body, so they lay flat against the rock. They have a big muscular foot like a lot of mollusks do, but they use it to kind of cling onto that rock as the tide goes in and out. Similarly, limpets have very flat bodies as well. They're kind of a cone shape, if you will, on the rock as well. And of course, barnacles are very good at hanging on because they're literally welded onto the rocks through calcium and other deposits. You'll often find patches of worm rock towards the infralittoral fringe and into the sublittoral in the rocky intertidal zones here in Florida, or specifically in South Florida, where you have a lot of sedimentation in the water. And these are actually true worms. They are polychaetes, and they take sand grains out of the water column and they glue them together to create their tubes. And they do this in a colonial fashion, which creates the rock itself. And you do want to be careful when you're around them, because if you are kind of stepping on them and smashing them, you can actually seal their tubes up and they might not be able to get back out to filter feed, because that's what they do. They filter feed for a living. Also, you'll see a lot of different types of algae, and we're just going to kind of categorize them all as turf algae because identifying specific species is a little difficult, but they will often be found, again, where they're going to be more wet more often. And that's also a note to say all of these species, I'm not necessarily getting down to the species. For example, there's several different species of Littoral snails. We're just getting a ballpark figure of what the different types of organisms that you're going to see in our rocky intertidal zones here in South Florida. Now it's time to throw it back to you. Why would a normally aquatic or marine species adapt to areas like the superlittoral fringe, where they have to deal with desiccation and temperature stress? Answer that in your summary notes, and until next time, keep thinking.